All right, here's the deal. You could have the best color grading technique in the world. You could be the slickest colorist on the block. If you don't have a repeatable system for conforming and setting up your project the same way every time and getting that underneath you in a good foundation so that you can grade, you're never going to be grading to your full potential. So that's what we're going to be talking about here in this episode of Grade School, is how I go about setting up and conforming my projects to give myself the ideal starting point for every grade that I tackle. It's a really, really critical part of any good color grading practice, and it allows you to spend more time color grading, less time troubleshooting, less time setting things up, and really allows you to reach your full potential. Everything that we're going to be talking about here today is stuff that we previously only talked about in my paid color grading course. We're pulling this all out from behind the paywall so that it's freely available to everybody, and to make room for a bunch of new stuff that we've added to that color grading course, the Colorist Career Accelerator. It's coming up soon in December, and I'm excited about that as well. So excited to talk with you guys today about setup, conform, and prep, and to make room for even newer and cooler stuff in the next round of the Colorist Career Accelerator. I've got a accompanying PDF guide that we're going to be going through today. If you want to grab this for yourself to help you get your edits set up and ready to translate over into Resolve, or simply over into the color page, even if you edited in Resolve, that's a free download. You just have to enter in your email address and you can get a link to that. So make sure you do that if you are interested in that. And that's it. We got a lot to cover. My buddy Gadali's here with me. What's going on, G?
Oh, hi there. You know, just hanging out, getting ready to learn. I'm actually was doing some Conform yesterday, so this is always good to brush up on the tips.
Oh, the Conform game is real. And it's funny, like whenever I do this, I'm always excited to like have this conversation because it gives me a chance to brush up on it, because it's one of those things that, like, I don't know, that gets a little rusty and you gotta dust the rust off. Is that a thing? Dust the rust off? I don't know. I'm excited to dive into this, guys. So let me just see what all we've got in store here. I got lots of stuff I want to cover with y'all. Cool. Let's party. By the way, everyone let us know. How do we sound? How do we look? Maybe I don't look amazing, but I'll do, right? But if you can hear me, I'll take that. Make sure that let us know if we're sounding too loud, too low, or too fast, too slow. Whatever your heart desires, Goldilocks us. Let's dive in, guys. So let me get my screen share on. And we're going to be talking about a couple of different dimensions of getting yourself set up for success inside of Resolve. And where we're going to start is with my template project that I use here inside of Resolve. And I'll kind of give you guys this qualifier for almost everything that we're going to be talking about here today. This stuff sounds super boring until you start doing it and until you start seeing like, whoa, it can feel this good. I'll tell you a quick story before we dive in. Where I really started to appreciate the value of having a well-set table every time you sit down to color grade was when I was working at a color grading shop, and I had color assistants for the first time in my career, and color assistants who knew exactly how to set up the project, how to conform things in. They would listen if I had specific things that I wanted or needed in place before I would begin color grading. It's a really amazing gift to give yourself to come in, sit down, and just begin to grade and know that everything is in place and you're not going to need to troubleshoot or play whack-a-mole or deal with problems that weren't fully solved in the conform, and to know that it's all there and everything that you want and need is right at your fingertips. So a lot of this stuff will sound kind of mundane and tedious, but I promise you, if you stick with me on these details and you commit to really being your own best assistant, you're going to have a lot more fun color grading, and it's going to be addictive, because the first time you do it, you're going to be like, oh, wow, this feels like driving an awesome car. And I've been driving around a not so awesome car. I've been driving around the Chevy Astro van that I got for my first car when I was 16. So bear with it even if it sounds boring. Where we're going to start here is we're going to go into my job template project that I have here. And this is a template that I use as the basis for every project that I begin. There's a couple reasons for this. Maybe the biggest one is if we look here in my bins in the upper left-hand side, I've already got all these bins pre-laid out. These bins, by the way, reflect a folder structure that is fundamentally the same for every project that we tackle. So we have a dedicated, like a SAN or a project server here at my shop, where all of our projects and the media and the assets live. And then within that, we've got folders that are going to be the same every single time. These bins largely mirror that same folder structure to make things super easy. And so we've got these different bins where things are set up to go into. If you don't know what all these mean, don't worry. We're going to talk about most of them here today. but a lot of them are pretty self-explanatory. The ones that we're going to be mostly focused on today are our footage, our timelines, and our ref. All right. So here's what we're going to do. Actually, before we even start importing footage in here, I want to take a look at some of the other dimensions of this template project. By the way, I feel kind of self-conscious about this like proteiny drink that I'm drinking today, so pay no attention. Pretend it's milk. I don't know. I'm going to take a sip. All right, let's go into our project settings here. So I'm going to go Shift-9 to hit my project settings, and let's just start from the top and go all the way through here. So my master settings, these things I don't care a ton about. My timeline resolution, my frame rate, those things are going to be dependent on the edit that we receive in, and we are going to talk about resolution in depth in just a minute. But for now, until I start importing a timeline, I'm not particularly worried about these things because I know they're going to change, or they may change. This video monitoring section, this is going to be particular to your setup. I have it set up in the way that works for my reference monitor and for my output box, which is a Blackmagic Ultra Studio 4K Mini. So I've got that set up to work with things there. I've got my render cache set up here to go to my scratch drive. Again, these are all things that are kind of like set up by default in this template project. So my cache files is going to my dedicated scratch drive. My gallery stills are going to their traditional place, their normal place. My render cache format is set to ProRes HQ. That's because I cache at the end of the color pipeline as opposed to in the middle of it, so ProRes HQ is fine. If I were doing otherwise, you might want to do something like ProRes Quad 4 XQ, but for me this works great. Image scaling we're going to circle back to. Again, this is going to be highly dependent on the timeline that we're working with, the project that we're working with. Color management, we're going to not really touch on color management very much today. I might set up some basic color management if we have time, but we just did a really deep dive on color management in our last episode of grade school, so definitely encourage you to check that out if you're wanting to brush up on your color management game. All I will say for today is here on the channel in 2024, going forward, we are color managing in nodes, not in our project settings. So I'm always going to have my color science set to DaVinci YRGB here. That said, I am going to go ahead and tag my timeline and output color space, as we talked about in our color management edition of grade school last round, because these things, while not directly color managing the image, are going to influence things like the behavior of the HDR zones palette. They're going to influence things like the tags that are baked into our renders when we go to deliver on the deliver page. So just because these aren't actually managing my image doesn't mean that we want to overlook them. I do go ahead and have these filled out, and I've got them filled out the same way every time. The only variation here is if I'm doing a delivery for like traditional non-YouTube applications, I would have this tagged to 709 Gamma 2.4 because that's what I'll be targeting. In the case of our work today, I'm actually going to be targeting 709 Gamma 2.2, so I have my output color space set accordingly. Down here below, I have my macOS viewing transforms set up, which allows me to get an image that looks more like my reference monitor here in my viewer inside of my GUI monitor. So that's what that's set up for. This is a free download that there should be a link to in the description for today's video. Here's another really important one. This one is so easy to snooze on. 3D lookup table interpolation, tetrahedral. Does that sound really uncatchy and confusing and daunting to you guys? It did to me. It's like, what in the world could that possibly mean? I have no clue, and what significance could it have? Here's the TLDR here. 3D lookup table interpolation. What is interpolation? Interpolation is just an educated guess. Interpolation is just an estimation, okay? 3D lookup tables, the application of lookup tables involves mostly interpolation. It's mostly educated guesses about, based on this input, what should the output be given this particular LUT. There are different ways to estimate that output point. The most basic and also the worst is trilinear, also the one that Resolve, for whatever reason, happens to default to. So in your template project or in your default settings, which you can save a preset for here as well, I highly encourage setting tetrahedral this way so that you don't forget to do it and so that you don't end up with weird artifacts in your image and you're trying to figure out what's going on. Did I do that? Is that my LUT? Is it a bad LUT? And then you realize, oh, I didn't flip my project settings LUT interpolation to tetrahedral. Trilinear can cause lots of issues. Definitely want to flip this over to tetrahedral, okay? Oh, I just opened my LUT folder. I don't need that. Thanks anyway, Resolve. That's all we're going to be doing for here. General options. As many of y'all know, I like to have my S-curve for contrast turned off. And camera raw, this is going to depend on what raw formats you're even using, but I've gone ahead in this template project and set these things all up to reflect the way I would want to decode any of these raw formats. I'm not going to go through all of these right now, but suffice to say this is a worthwhile thing to spend time doing just the one time so that you never have to do it again. So much of what we're going to be talking about today, like I said, it's about being your own assistant. It's about right now you trying to take really, really good care of future you, right? So I've tried to take really good care of future Cullen and be like, hey, dude, you never have to worry about your camera raw settings ever again. I've got them all set up exactly for your workflow and how I know you like to work. All you got to do is set up your color management once you've got your timeline conformed. So I'm not going to go through all these. Again, we talked about this, I believe, in our color management workshop. If we didn't, we'll have to do a little pickup video on that. But I'm not going to dive into full detail on this. And in the case of the timeline that we're going to be conforming in just a moment, there actually is no raw media, so it won't be particularly applicable to what we're doing today. Capture and playback, basically all of this stuff, I'm going to give you guys the cheat code here. You don't really need to worry about this stuff for like 99% of applications. Capture and playback has very narrow, very limited application, more for legacy workflows. Subtitles and transcription, something that doesn't touch my world very often anyway. Fairlight, we're color people. I'm a colorist. I don't know about Fairlight. I don't know about the audio page. I don't mean to sound dismissive. Fairlight's rad and audio mixing is rad, but again, not something we're particularly concerned with on the color side. And path mapping and Blackmagic Cloud also kind of out of our scope for today. All right, so that's our project settings. Now, here's what I want to do. I want to conform in a timeline. And the way we're going to start with that is we're going to take a look at the Conform prep guide that I mentioned at the beginning of this session. By the way, this training, I'm going to try to keep it to around an hour. We might go a little bit over, so if we do, then, and you have to bounce, then you won't hurt my feelings, but I hope you can stick around. And if you do have to bounce, then you can, of course, check out the recording later. So let's take a look at this Conform prep guide for a second here. So this is the PDF download that you can grab. There will be a link to it in the description for this video. This is basically a guide for whether you are working with a client or whether you are yourself the editor of a project that you're now wanting to grade. This is a guide for how to prep your edit and get it ready for conforming into the color page inside of Resolve. Now, what the heck is Conform? Conform, if we want to give a kind of simple working definition, Conform is translating your edit one-to-one from wherever you locked it and said, yes, this is my edit, this is what I want to now go grade, whether that happened in Resolve, whether that happened in Premiere or Avid or Final Cut Pro. Conform is simply rebuilding that edit to be frame accurate to exactly what you signed off on when you locked the edit. Sounds obvious, right? It also sounds like, really? That takes 3 pages to do? Unfortunately, it does. This is like one of the biggest, on the professional color grading side, this is like one of the biggest black holes of color grading out there, in the sense that like you can take a thing that should have taken an hour and it can end up taking all day, or it can take multiple days if you don't ask for the right things or if you don't know what you're doing. So this is something you really want to like optimize and get tuned up. All right, so let's take a look here at this guide, and we're just going to briefly walk through here. There are 2 workflows that are outlined here. We're only going to go through one of these workflows today, the source media workflow. This is the workflow I highly, highly encourage you to use. The flat QuickTime workflow, honestly, that is a workflow that mostly exists to accommodate clients who are on a tight turnaround, who are low literacy in terms of their editing platform, and they just need to turn something around so fast that there's not even time for this one, but I don't generally encourage using it, okay? So I'm just going to briefly walk through what we're going to be doing in here. And again, this is either you, these are instructions to you if you are the editor of the project, or they're instructions to the editor of the project if that's somebody different, okay? So regardless of whether you are editing in Resolve, regardless of whether you are editing in some other NLE, here's the process. You're going to duplicate your sequence. Why? Because you're about to make changes to your sequence and you don't want to lose your one master lock to edit if something goes sideways. You're going to remove graphics and any other elements that don't need color. Only exception there would be if you actually are wanting to do your final deliverables, your final finishing inside of Resolve, in which case you would leave those things as is. But one of the good first principles of Conform is the easiest asset to conform is no asset at all. So I don't want to waste my time conforming in assets that are not even needed for me to touch. Like in my case, when I'm color grading something, graphics or audio mix and stuff like that, I'm like, I don't want to waste my time conforming that in. I'm never going to touch it. There's no need for me to conform it in, right? A lot easier for me to conform nothing than it is for me to conform something. We're going to collapse our clips and edits down into as few tracks as possible. You really should only need 1 to 2 in general. And after you complete this process, your litmus test is there shouldn't be any clips or pieces of clips that are buried under another clip that's higher up so that you're not actually seeing that clip. Does that make sense? I don't know how you guys edit. I haven't edited professionally in a long time, or really in any capacity in a long time. But when I did, I definitely had a tendency to kind of stack stuff up as we're trying. Oh, maybe it's this take, maybe it's that take, maybe it's this timing. Maybe we go to the wide, then we go to the single. Maybe we go to the 2-shot, then we go to the wide. You're auditioning and playing with different things, and you end up with an edit that, while it may represent your creative intent, it's also kind of a hot mess, right? So what we want to do here is collapse that stuff down. Again, we're trying to make things as easy as possible on future you. You're trying to make future you's work or life as easy as possible. Or if this is an editor prepping things for you, you're asking them for their help in making things as easy as possible. Okay? So we're going to collapse everything down. You really only need 1 to 2 clips in most cases, 1 to 2 tracks, I should say. You're going to join any through edits. What the heck is a through edit? A through edit is just a clip that you've randomly bladed into 2 clips that doesn't need to be bladed into 2 clips. It's just one continuous clip with a cut point somewhere in between them, or somewhere within it, I should say, that isn't needed. Okay, so a through edit is something we want to look out for and delete or get rid of, unless it's being used to divide, like, oh, we're punching in on the incoming side of the through edit, or we are doing a retime on one but not both of those clips. But unless it's something like that, you don't need it and you want to get rid of it. Again, easier to conform 1 edit than it is to conform 2 edits. This one's important. We're actually going to see examples of what happens when these instructions aren't observed in a little bit when we start conforming. You want to ensure any multicam clips are flattened. What does that mean? That means that instead of being this like magic multicam clip entity that's very helpful for editors when they're editing, you want to flatten that out and be like, hey, replace that multicam like sort of abstract object with the actual physical asset that I decided to cut to at this point in the timeline. Otherwise, it's going to create problems when we go into conform, or at least it can. Same thing with compound clips and nested sequences. These are all really variations of the same things. So multicam clips, compound clips, nested sequences, they're all kind of the same thing. It is clips within a clip, right? We don't want clips within a clip. We just want the clips themselves on our timeline. So we want to ensure that these things are flattened and compound clips or nested sequences have been replaced with their actual source clips. You're going to replace any proxies or transcoded clips with the original source clips. Again, we're asking the editor, whether that's you or someone else, to make things easy for us, to put things in such a state that it's really easy for us just to link up our timeline in Resolve to the assets that we're actually going to be using to grade. We don't want to grade proxies or transcoded clips, right? And we could conform from the proxies back to the full quality media on our side, but it's generally going to be easier, faster, and more predictable for it to be done on the editorial side than to wait for it to be hitting color, if that makes sense. You're going to delete empty video tracks and delete all audio clips and tracks. Exception here would be, again, if you plan to do your final deliverables from Resolve, you can leave those things in, but otherwise get rid of them because it's not going to matter, right? Like, I'm not going to be doing anything to your audio mix. There's no point in me conforming it in. You're going to copy all your source media to a work drive. This is only necessary if you're grading on a different system than your NLE. Otherwise, you can just point to the same resources on your same drive. You're going to export an XML or an AAF. This is the actual file that's going to tell me how to take all of this footage and reassemble it inside of Resolve to match the edit that you locked in whatever your other NLE was. This is only necessary if you're not already in Resolve. If you're already in Resolve, you're good. And basically everything we've been doing up until now is to make things tidy and easy to navigate on the color page. Make sense? Lastly, you're going to export a ProRes or a DNxHD QuickTime of your sequence. Again, this is only necessary if you're not already in Resolve, because if you're in Resolve, you don't need to confirm the conform, if you will. If you're working in another system, like this is the way it goes in my world, if I'm getting all the assets that I just talked about from an editor, I also want to have the ability to confirm I've done my job correctly. So if everything conforms in and it looks correct, how do I know every single edit is frame on accurate, exactly what it needs to be? We're going to match to our reference QuickTime and make sure that the timeline I've just rebuilt in Resolve matches the reference QuickTime that they provided, okay? And we typically, on the professional side, are going to request timecode burn-in for this QuickTime. This is something that you can, if you're working with clients or you're working with collaborators and you want to make things even easier on yourself, I highly recommend. You can ask for I typically ask for burned in record time code and burned in source time code, which are respectively the time code of the timeline versus the time code of the individual clip in that timeline at that point. That's not strictly necessary. It might be beyond your skill level or ability depending on who the editor is or if you're the editor yourself, but that is something that we often ask for on the professional side. All right, the flat QuickTime workflow, I'm going to leave you guys to review this on your own, but essentially this is for a down and dirty, quick turnaround, not super high literacy client who just needs to get the edit to you as quickly as possible and have you grade it. The TLDR here, the basics is, hey, instead of all that stuff that I just told you, just export a QuickTime and I'll slice it up on my side. Sounds easy, right? Couple downsides here, we list these down at the bottom. The main ones are that dissolves and other transitions are going to be problematic at best. In some cases, we're not going to be able to accommodate them and dissolve between our grades in a way that is undetectable. The resolution of your final render is going to be limited to the resolution of that QuickTime that you render out, even if your original resolution was higher. So that's something you want to be mindful of. And if you've got layered or composited things like graphics on top of image, those are going to be graded as one thing, which can also be problematic. So those are some of the big limitations to be aware of in this workflow. Lastly, we've got a glossary of terms, NLE, through edit, repo. We talked about two of these three things anyway as we were going along. All right, so that's your Conform prep guide. This is a great guide for you if you're the editor or to provide to an editor you're working with if you're not. All right. We'll take a breather just a minute for any questions that have come in so far.
All right, a couple questions. Oh, also, some people said that I wasn't coming through the stream, just being picked up by your mic.
Oh.
Audio-wise.
Let's remedy that real fast. Tell me something good, Gadeli.
Okay. Well, I can also tell you the questions we have.
Yeah, tell me the questions. It looks
one-
like you're coming through.
Yeah. One is, how do you handle grading VFX as the final deliverable?
How do you handle grading VFX as the final deliverable? I'm not sure I understand that question.
It may be, this maybe just how to handle VFX with color management and maybe clarifying in what order color happens with VFX. Are you grading
yeah,
that are in display space? Are they coming back in camera?
Cool. Yeah. So we'll see some hands-on example of that in just a moment. But basically, the way that we will interface with the VFX side of things is we'll say like, hey, if we're doing the pulls, we're not always doing the pulls, but we often are. If we're doing pulls, we'll say, hey, pulls just meaning we give you the assets to do VFX on, essentially. What we'll say is like, hey, you tell me what you want color space wise for those pulls. All that we ask is that you give us back that same color space, and that should be a scene space as opposed to a display color space. So we can give you aces, we can give you camera native, whatever you want, and then we will request those same renders come back in that same color space as the original material was sent out in. And as long as we're observing that workflow, we can cut in VFX before we begin color, we can cut in VFX halfway through, we can cut in VFX at the end. Really the only catch is like, well, if we're cutting in at the end, then no one gets to review the VFX with a grade, right? So earlier the better, but just for the practical reason of wanting everyone to have the chance to see the VFX with color, you can kind of slot it in terms of like the work happening. It can be happening in parallel and you can slot the VFX in that sense whenever you want. It's just a question of wanting to give everyone who's reviewing the opportunity to see actual final VFX with the color applied before we sign off and we say, okay, deliver the whole thing. Any others we should hit right now?
What's that?
Sorry, go ahead.
Okay. A Thackeray was wondering, when receiving non-RAW ProRes 444 footage, but you do know which camera each shot was captured on, should you group the footage by camera type and apply CST based on each specific camera's profile?
Yes, definitely so. And there's different ways to go about that, but yes, if we want to be at that point with every project that we tackle of knowing every camera that the material was shot on and knowing which clip was shot on which camera so that we can organize and color manage those things accordingly. Yeah.
Let's see. Ryan's wondering, do you need to use the macOS LUT even when going through a Decklink or Ultra Studio to a calibrated monitor?
No. So that macOS LUT is only for my GUI here. It is not in line at all for my reference monitor. And you can see here in my project settings that it is living under color viewer lookup table, which means it's only going to change the output of my GUI color viewer, not of my reference monitor. Good question.
And Andrew's saying, I usually do a round trip from Premiere to Resolve and back. Often source clips are with different sizes and resolutions. Is there a way to keep original resolution when doing a round trip?
Yeah, we're going to touch on that in just a minute here, and I'll give you kind of my guidance on how I like to handle resolution and round tripping there, yeah. All right, you guys want to conform some stuff? Let's conform. So here's what we're going to do. We're already in our template project. First thing that I'm going to do anytime I open up my template project is I'm going to save a copy, right? So let's call this, we're going to be conforming a project that is actually going to be part of the Colorist Career Accelerator course coming up in December. So this is one of two projects that is available for participants in the course to practice your color grading, to use on your reel, and to follow along with the exercises during class. For today, you can just watch and learn as I go through this process. So here's what we're going to do. There are different ways to conform, kind of an overwhelming number of different ways to conform. I'm going to show you guys the way that I like to do this. So number one, I've just saved off a copy. I've got all my project settings already in place and set up. And what I'm going to do is go into my footage bin here, and then I'm going to go and find my footage folder on my machine here. Let me track this thing down. Yeah, here we go. So I've got my footage, and I'm just going to drag all this footage here into this bin, okay? Change project frame rate. The selected clips have a different frame rate to the project. Would you like to change your timeline frame rate to match? Yes, I would. 99 out of 100 times, yes, I would. Unless the material was shot at a different frame rate than you are editing and delivering it, which would be very rare. So I'm going to say yes to this. And that's a great example of what I pointed out earlier. My timeline frame rate here in my project settings just changed, right? 23976 across the board now. And it was smart enough to change my video monitoring frame rate as well, which of course I want. Generally, you want all three of these things to agree. Very, very edge case, weird workflows anytime you would have these things differ from one another. So that's my footage. Now, we talked about VFX a minute ago, and we indeed have VFX for this project. It turns out the VFX are actually already done before we begin color, which is always fun. So what I'm going to do before I conform is I'm going to pull in my VFX. Essentially, this stage of the process is all about figuring out where do the assets live that my timeline is going to need, that it's going to go looking for when I bring it in. And in my case, they live in two different places. They live in the footage folder on my hard drive, and they live in the VFX folder on my hard drive. So I'm going to drop my VFX into their bin and my footage into its bin, respectively. Okay, now we're going to go to our timelines, and this is where we're actually going to do our conform. So I'm going to go File, Import, Timeline, like so. Now, I've got some timelines that were handed to me by the editor of this project, and they were put together based on the prep guide that I gave to them, which is very similar to the one that we just looked at in terms of the instructions within there. And I've got a couple different variations here, but what we're going to do is the Final Cut XML. The DRT is kind of the easiest, but for that reason, I'm going to skip past it because I'm going to assume in this scenario, if you are already in Resolve, if your edit is already in Resolve, then you're either on the same system and you don't even need the DRT, or if you're just coming from one Resolve system to another, I actually encourage using a DRP instead of a DRT. DRTs work pretty well most of the time, but DRPs, meaning a full DaVinci project, it's pretty bulletproof. It's pretty easy. Like if you've got it all set up and linked up to your footage on machine A, and you export a DRP and you put all that footage onto a hard drive and you load it up onto a machine B and point that project to the location of that footage, you're not going to have any surprises. It's going to be really easy. So I typically recommend a DRP over a DRT. In our case, we're going to look at conforming from a different NLE. This project, I actually don't remember what it was edited in, but it was not edited in Resolve. So we're going to conform this in the way that I would more typically conform in a project from another NLA. So I'm going to say import here, okay? Now, we got all these settings to look at here. First thing to look at, XMLs can actually have more than one timeline. It's very rare that an editor would know this or would cook more than one XML or more than one timeline into an XML. But I've had projects where I've been like, dude, the timeline you're sending me is totally whack. Like, it doesn't look at all like the reference. What's going on? Like, you need to try exporting another one for me. And they're like, no, it's right. We swear it's right. And it's because there is actually more than one timeline here. So pay attention to this if your XML is coming from someone other than you. Okay? In this case, we just have the one, which is going to be what happens the majority of the time. Timeline name, I typically am going to leave to match the name of the timeline that they exported. Automatically set project settings and import source clips. I'm going to say no to these things. I've just imported my source clips myself. This is another way you could do things, but I find this to be more error prone than what I just did. And automatically set project settings, you can see what that's going to toggle down below. So I'm going to just manually deal with any project settings that need to change as opposed to changing things here at this point. Sizing information I'm going to turn on, even though, spoiler alert, this answers the question that came up a minute ago from regarding round tripping from Premiere to Resolve and back. Here's the frustrating truth. Sizing doesn't really travel very well between these systems. I don't mean that the actual attributes don't travel. Those actually travel fairly reliably, but you're not going to get the same result in both because of the differences in the way that Premiere handles sizing versus Final Cut versus Resolve. So this is one of the reasons why our reference QuickTime is so important, and one of the reasons why when I'm doing a round trip workflow, any sizing that I might do, any repos that I might do in the room with my client, I'm actually going to turn those off when I deliver so that the sizing can be handled in the final online or the final finished edit when it's rebuilt back inside of Premiere or whatever the NLE is. In this case, I'm going to leave use sizing information on because it's always easy to turn it off later. Color information, don't care about that at all, so I'm going to leave that off. All right, let's hit OK here. Let's see how we do. Now it's going to ask me, all right, since you're not automatically importing source clips, where in your project do you want me to look for footage? I'm going to tell it, even though I don't really have any assets except the ones that are okay to conform with, just out of good practice, I'm going to say, only look in here. Don't look in any of these other folders for other assets. These are the only ones that I want you to look in, okay? Now I'm going to hit OK. Now, what just happened here? I'm not going to lie to you guys. I'm going to be honest. That never happens. There's always, almost always some kind of error, some kind of file that couldn't be found. But here's the fun part. The reason why this didn't happen, it's not because I've like led the witness a bunch here and like pre-gamed this to work perfectly. This is actually how it worked when I did this project for real. The reason it worked this way is because the editor followed my instructions. So if anyone has any experience with Conform and you've had that nightmare scenario of like, oh, I've imported it and I've got this error and that error and that error and I've got to track them down and figure out what's going on, a ton of that can be mitigated just by providing clear instructions to the people you're working with about how you would like things to be turned over to you, and then pulling things in with that setup that you've got in place, okay? So we've got a new edit pulled in. Now, that's the good news. The bad news is, well, great, I've got this timeline of stuff. How in the world do I know that every single one of these shots is correct and has the right timing and the right handles and cuts to the next shot at the right time? How do I confirm all of that? This is where Conform really comes in. We are going to use the offline reference that the editor prepped for me to get things conformed in. And you can see, just I'll point out here, I ended up, in addition to my timeline, I've got these assets that came in along with it. These are compound clips. These are compound clips that the editor forgot to remove per my instructions. So we're going to have to deal with those when they come up in the timeline. And this is always the judgment call again. This is more applicable if you're working with other people. You want to assess really early on, like, all right, is this a viable starting point for me, or do I need to request a resupply or have a conversation before I start trying to brute force conform an edit? Because that's no fun and can be very, very time consuming. In this case, we've got a pretty good starting point, at least without having seen the reference QuickTime yet. I'm going to assume that we're in pretty good shape here. So here's what we're going to do next. I'm going to go to my media pool, and I'm going to go to my reference folder within this job folder, 3ref, and I'm going to go to my reference bin down here. Now, because this is a reference, I need to bring it in a different way. I'm going to right click and I'm going to say add as offline reference clip, like so. You can see when I do this, I'm going to have this little checkerboard icon next to it. And this means, this tells Resolve, this is not a clip to be graded or dealt with the way I would deal with any other clip. This is a clip that I'm going to use to confirm that I've properly built my timeline, okay? So now that I've got this pulled in here, I can go to my timelines, go to this timeline that we just pulled in, right click, I'm going to go timelines, link offline reference clip, and select this reference that I just pulled in. The only items that you will see here are ones that you imported with that add as offline reference clip import method that I just used, okay? So I'm going to say, let's do that. And now if I go over to my edit page, and let's just go to our first couple of frames here, I'm going to hit Command W, and you can see I'm wiping to my image. Now it turns out that this film starts off with like the least definitive image for confirming a conform of all time, TV snow. So just for the sake of kind of getting my bearings, I'm going to go a couple edits in here and look at this one. And let's take my inspector down. I'm also going to go to a single canvas view here. And I'm just going to hit Command W now. And I can see from experience that I am temporally like frame on. So that's great news. We can also all see visually that in the reference, I am zoomed in more. I have less pillar boxing than in the actual rebuilt edit here inside of Resolve, right? So what's going on with that? What's the deal? Well, here's where we need to take a detour and we need to talk in detail about sizing. This is like a great snippet of the conversation to take notes on. This is going to make your life so much easier if you apply my system for how to handle sizing when you're color grading. So this timeline has a common feature to it that we see a lot when we're color grading and editing. It has letterboxing, right? There's all kinds of reasons to letterbox, ranging from that's how we framed it to we think it looks cool to add letterboxing. We think it makes it look cinematic to add letterboxing. I remember doing that like in video production class in high school and being like, we didn't even frame for it. I would just add the letterboxing and then tilt the frame down or, like drop it down with its Y. Cause I'm like, it just looks more like, like the Goodfellas DVD that I have at home, right? So there's all kinds of reasons that we can apply letterboxing, but letterboxing is a big feature of what we're doing when we're color grading and editing, right? We need a system for managing aspect ratio, okay? So stick with me. Here's gonna be my system for managing aspect ratio. The first most important thing is we need a canvas, okay? We need a canvas that is active image area only. So if we think about this project for a moment, and this project being exhibited in its ideal form on every screen it's ever gonna be viewed on, what would that be? There would be no letterboxing, right? It would just be this canvas, this aspect ratio. If this movie had its way, every TV would be that wide. Every movie theater screen would be that wide. Every monitor would be exactly that wide, right? So we want, for the sake of our color portion, to treat the world as that simple. So this is what that looks like. Let's take a look at our offline reference clip. This is going to be our clue. So the offline reference clip, this won't always be the case, but here it is. The offline reference clip only has active image within it, 3840 by 1634. So the letterboxing that I'm seeing is actually it being fit into a 1080 or a 16 by 9 aspect ratio. The native here is 3840 by 1634. And if you want to confirm that, you can go completely outside of Resolve and just open it in QuickTime. It's not going to look visually correct necessarily, but you can see there is no letterboxing on here. This is great news because this tells me this is the actual canvas that this filmmaker wants, okay? So because it's the canvas that the filmmaker wants, I'm going to go into my project settings here, and I'm going to change my timeline resolution to be 3840 by 1634, okay? Now there's a few more things that I need to do up until this point, or in addition to this, I should say, because this is where I'm actually going to be doing my grading. When I'm doing my grading, I do not want any active image area being blotted out or blacked out. I just want to decide, because I can make this whatever I want, I just want to make this exactly what it needs to be, such that my image has the proper aspect ratio with no padding, left or right, top or bottom, okay? But there's a couple things that are going to need to happen before and after this for it all to work. Let's start with the before. For this, we're going to go to our image scaling. What are we going to do? What do we need to do to ensure that our actual image fills that canvas, right? If you look at the default, I believe the default in Resolve is scale entire image to fit. I'm going to hold down Option and hit Save here, and we can see what happens. Okay, so you can see my timeline resolution has just changed. I've got smaller letterboxes. This is a wider canvas, but because I've instructed Resolve, for files which don't have the same exact resolution as the canvas which I have chosen for displaying my image, scale those in such a way that I see every single pixel of the original image. Well, what happens if the original image is wider than my canvas? It's what we're looking at right here, right? This original image is wider than the canvas. And as a byproduct, I am getting a little narrow letterbox, top and bottom, in order to fit this wider image into this narrower canvas. That's not what we want in this case. If we're saying, hey, that's my native, true, desired canvas and aspect ratio, well, we should fill the image with it, shouldn't we? So I always do scale full frame with crop. I won't say always, but I can't think of an exception where I wouldn't at the moment. Scale full frame with crop. Now watch what happens. I'm going to hit save. Okay, so we've saved that and we're now scaling full frame with crop. We're not seeing a change quite yet because there's one more thing we have to do. The one more thing we have to do is we have to acknowledge the world that this image is going to find its way into. In this world, hate to break it to you, movie, we don't have a bunch of TVs that are a native 3840 by 1634 aspect ratio. In fact, you are never going to be shown on any display ever that has that native aspect ratio, so you are going to be a victim of letterboxing top and bottom. But we want to save that letterboxing until after we've done our work in the color grade. So what we're going to do now is go back to our master settings, and actually I take it back. We're going to go right back where we were, image scaling. Output scaling, I'm going to turn this off. I'm going to say, nope, don't match my timeline settings. I want you to format me, in my case, for a 3840 by 2160 deliverable. And what am I going to do if my canvas does not fit into my output resolution? In this case, I do want to scale my entire image to fit, meaning don't crop stuff left and right, letterbox as needed in order to preserve the canvas that I have asked for in my master settings. So I'm going to hit save here. And we can now see I have a padded UHD frame. And this fundamentally looks similar to something like we had a minute ago. But a couple things are important here. Number one, because this letterboxing is happening after my timeline resolution and after my grade, I'm not going to inadvertently grade the letterbox and lighten the black point of the letterbox or bias the letterbox blue or whatever it might be. This is happening downstream of my color grade. So that's number one. And just as important, maybe more important, if we look at our reference, we should now have a better fit with it. Now the only thing we need to take a look at here, so I've got 3840 by 1634. Let's take a look at our reference clip here and figure out, we should be seeing, when I'm going in to conform something, I don't want to just conform the image, I want to actually conform the framing from the offline as well. So we got scale full frame with crop. That's all correct. Let's see here. Oh, you know what? There's one more thing we need to look at here. This is a really fun snafu that even as many times as I've looked at this project, I still forget sometimes. This can happen. So with project settings that travel over from another editor, even though I have told Resolve, here is how I would like you to handle input scaling, check this out. If I look at my inspector for this clip, and I go down to my scaling section, it has taken it upon itself to flip away from project settings for its scaling. That is sneaky, right? Watch what happens if I flip to project settings. And now if I wipe, other than the burn-in, things are indistinguishable from my offline reference. That's my ideal scenario when I'm conforming, is an ideal wipe or a zero change wipe to my offline reference clip, okay? Now what's funny is this is gonna persist for all of my clips. They've all had their scaling set to fit. So I'm gonna hit Command A, and I'm gonna just do this. I'm gonna set the scaling to fit, and then back to project settings to ensure that every clip in this timeline is having its scaling determined by what I asked for in the project settings, all right? So I have asked my editor for what I need, and I've asked them to simplify things and set the table for me as well as possibly can be set before anything even lands on my side. I've done a little bit of detective work and fussing and setup before I even begin going in and conforming. Because by the way, I really haven't started conforming yet. Conforming is an edit by edit process that we're going to begin right now. But because we've set all these pieces in place so well, this part's going to be really easy. I'm going to do it in like 5 minutes, okay? So we've got everything in place here. And let's just talk about how we're going to go through here. Now, there's different ways to go about this, guys. So like the wipe style that we've got here, right now I'm looking at a horizontal wipe. I can do a vertical wipe. It's actually really tough right now because I'm seeing literally no difference between the two states of image. You can also do a difference mode. Difference mode simply says subtract the reference image from the active image that you're looking at. So if you see pure black, that means you've got a dead match, right? And just for the sake of example, if this clip was like a couple frames out, you would start to see, oh, I happen to pick the most static frame in the whole setup. Let's look at this one when the dude's walking. If this happened to be a few frames out, you would see like a ghost image, like that, right? So the fact that I'm not seeing that tells me we are dead on conformed. So here's the process. Here's what we're going to do from here. I also want to make sure, I'm going to go back to my master settings. I'm going to set my video monitoring resolution to match my UHD setup here so that things look correct over here as well. All right, great. So here's what we're going to do. We're just going to go in and we're going to go edit by edit. So looks like on this very first edit, I'm missing a fade up. So if I just look at if I turn my difference mode back to a horizontal wipe for a second, I'm fading up in the reference. I'm not fading up here. So I could add a quick dissolve to that. Kind of match that in, something like that. And then these first few I'm not going to worry too much about because they're so staticky, or rather they just are static and impossible to make a definitive conclusion about, but they look right. This looks great. And now I'm going to start going edit by edit. So I'm going to do down arrow to go next edit. And then I'm going to go one frame to the left to check the outcoming clip or the outgoing clip that we just moved off of. Still looks good. Now I'm going to do down and down to go to the next edit. Frame to the left to check the outgoing frame of the outcoming or the outgoing, the last frame of the outgoing clip. Looks good. I'm going to hit down for next edit once, down for next edit again. And I'm going to tap left and then go back to the right. Now on this one, we got some problems, don't we? Here's a good rule of thumb. Difference mode is helpful for uncovering problems. It is not helpful for solving them. So I'm like, I got no idea what I'm looking at there until I actually start looking at normal images. So I'm going to flip back to my prior image here. So it looks to me like we got the full-on wrong clip here. If we look at the reference, it's really just this clip continuing, isn't it? Oh, it looks like I moved this inadvertently when I was demoing. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to bump this over 6 frames. I'm going to extend this shot back out by 6 frames. Actually, that's not what we want because, no, yes it is. We're going to extend this out like so. And let's now go back to our difference mode. And I'm going to go to the edit point. Okay, now we're good on the edit point. And I'm just going to frame well into the clip to make sure that I fully solve the issue. Okay, now I'm back in my flow. So I'm going to go down arrow again. We're good on this incoming side. Remember, your playhead and resolve, just like in any NLE, it's showing you the first frame to the right of where the playhead is. So I know this first frame of the incoming shot is good, and by tapping one to the left, I know the last frame of the outgoing shot is also good. Now I'm going to do what? Down, down, right? Next edit, one frame to the left, still looking good, down, down. One frame to the left, still looking good, down, down. One frame to the left, still looking good, down, down. One frame to the left, still looking good, down, down. You guys see the flow that we're getting into here? It's kind of tedious, but goes really fast once you've got the table set properly. Now, here's what I'm going to do. Oh, good, comes up right here. Here's something that I called out a minute ago that I want to talk about. We got a problem, right? Again, difference mode, good for observing a difference, terrible for actually knowing what to do or even knowing what's happening, at least for me. So I'm going to go back to a different wipe style here. And if I look at what I have versus what they have, like, oh, why is mine inset on all four sides? What the heck's going on there? Well, if I pay attention here, I can see this is where that compound clip is living that I called out before. So my compound clip is causing one of the many problems compound clips can cause, because here I've already set my scaling to be correct to project settings like we did everywhere else. But check this out. If I drill into this compound clip by right-clicking and going Open in Timeline, and if I select this, what's my scaling at? Fit, again. So I need to go Project Settings, and then pop back out. And now it's dead on again. Now, it turns out there are, we saw here when we imported, whatever, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 instances of these compound clips throughout the timeline that I'm going to assume for now are all going to have this issue, meaning I'm going to have to manually solve it. This is a judgment call. This is something I could reach back out to the client about and be like, hey, this looks awesome, but I've got these compound clips that I'm going to have to manually solve. Can you replace those compounds with their original asset and resupply? Or I can say, I can probably handle that pretty fast and it's not really worth waiting for them to resupply. In this case, I think I'm fine just going in and handling it. And I also know now, anytime I've got a compound clip, I'm going to need to expect that, right? So that just becomes kind of a part of one of the side missions of this Conform, is anytime I've got a compound, which I happen to have a bunch of right at the beginning, I can go drill into there and do it. Now, you might be asking, if you're a little more advanced in the Resolve Edit page, why don't I just right-click this and say, what is the command for it here? There's actually an option to just replace this with the original clip. Let's see here. Let's look at one of these here. Well, at least there usually is. Yeah, you might be asking, why don't I just automatically replace these with their source asset? And one reason apparently is that that option that I'm expecting to see is not turning up at the moment. But the bigger issue is there's speed changes being applied here. And if I want to replace this with the original clip, I'm going to have to copy and paste the speed change. And it just feels easier to me to open in timeline, adjust my scaling, and move on with it. I'm only going to have to do this a max of 11 times, right? Which is 11 more times than I would like to, but not the end of the world. And those 11 may all happen right here. And I can tell you guys from experience with this project, this is kind of like the one curveball that really came up. Once we got past this section and we got these compound clips all tuned up, everything went pretty easily. So we're just going to go through and zip those up. Yeah, it looks like 2 more here. And then we'll take a pause in just a second and we can answer any questions. Let's just finish this last one and then do a few more edits as our confidence check here. So now we're past those. We're back into our normal wipe scenario. Frame to the left, good. Frame to the left, down, down. Frame to the left, down, down. Frame to the left, down, down. It's fun. You don't even actually have to see the image, right? You're just looking at confirming that you've got no issues here, right? So you get the idea. This is how I would conform this in. We're 3 minutes in now to a 12-minute timeline. Another 3-4 minutes and I would be through the end of the timeline. It's possible other curveballs will come up. In this case, they generally don't. This is a pretty ideal scenario because it's stuff shot on a cinema camera, so it's going to have like sticky time code. The biggest issue you will run into with Conform is when you have timelines that contain MP4 or H.264 assets that don't carry time code very reliably. But that's the exact scenario where you want to have your reference QuickTime. Ideally, you would have burned in time code as well. And the worst case scenario is when Resolve has found the wrong clip completely. So just before I take a pause, here's what you can do if it's like, oh, my reference is asking for this clip, but I'm looking at a totally different clip here. I'm just gonna like make a example of this real fast here. So let's say I've got something like this. So it's like, oh, that's not even the right clip. Well, what I can do, if I had my ideal burn-ins, I would have source code, record time code, and clip name in the reference. Since I don't, I can just eyeball and look and try to find this frame. That can be really easy, or it can be more challenging depending on how much media you've got to work with. But I'm looking at wides here. I'm just going to look for this wide and assume there's just one where she is got her uniform off and she's stretching. I see that right here. So I'm going to click on this once, and then I'm going to right click on this clip in the timeline, and I'm going to say conform lock with media pool clip. And now if I wipe, I've got the right clip, I think. And what I can do is, let's go back to our difference mode here. This is where difference mode can also be helpful. I'm going to hit T to go into my roll trim mode here. And then I'm going to hit S so that I can slip. And I'm just going to move this to the left until I ideally can make the image go away. Now, as it turns out, I think I found a similar but not the correct clip for what I'm trying to do. So I'm going to go back to my normal wipe here, and I'm going to keep hunting for just a second. Yeah, here's the one that I was actually looking for. Right click, conform lock with media pool clip. That one's almost dead on. I'm just going to go to a difference mode. You can see that kind of like slight ghost that I have there. And as I slip this in, can you guys see that? Now I'm frame on. If I go back horizontal wipe, there we go. It's dead set. Okay, questions on anything we've talked about thus far today? That's a lot.
Let's see. Question a little from earlier from Jim Robinson saying, I still get paths all screwed up when it seems like the original path to the media is hard-coded in the XML. How do you deal with that scenario?
Yeah, great question. So the path thing, I get them screwed up all the time too. That's the reason I don't like to import the XML and have it try to find the footage for me. Meaning when I do this, the reason I don't do this automatically import thing is because it just never works. Like, it's very rare in my experience that the path in the XML that points to the assets is actually the path where it will find those assets when it goes to import right now. So the way I get around it is I explicitly say, hey, here is your body of footage to conform to. It's already here inside of Resolve. And it simply makes sure that only the footage that should be conformed to is in there, and all of the footage that should be conformed to is in there. It's a really easy way to sidestep any like path issues within the XML, because at that point it doesn't have the option to go looking down a dead path for its asset. The only place it's being given the opportunity to look is within the bins that you have told it it's going to find luck within. And it's at that point going to be looking at other metadata, things like clip name and time code and other things that it's going to have more success with than a file path. And hi, Jim, by the way. Good to see you, buddy. Good to hear you.
Let's see. How do you prefer to receive the reference? In what formats and any other parameters?
The most important things, as I think we kind of just saw when we were conforming in there, is like if I can get in our professional prep sheet, we do ask for source time code, record time code, and clip name. Now the reason I ask for those things is it's kind of obvious from some of the examples that we just looked at, but it's also kind of like a last ditch effort of like, even if you give me no XML and you give me a reference QuickTime with those things, I can actually rebuild the edit by hand just with that reference QuickTime. I don't want to. I'll be bummed about it. I'll send you a bill for it for sure, but I can't because all the information that I need is right there burned into that reference QuickTime. So that's really the only priority or preference that we have. Whether there's a display LUT on there, whether there's not a display LUT on there, like if you had a LUT that you loved using in editorial. I like to see that turned on just because it's a good creative reference when we get into that point of the process. And then beyond that, in terms of quality and stuff, like it doesn't matter to me too much. Like a ProRes LT or HQ or something like that is totally fine. Something that doesn't add a bunch to the data footprint of what you're already having to transmit over.
How do you handle if picture lock is changed after grading?
Oh, that's a great question. So what do we do after picture lock changes? So this is, again, the professional dimension of this are things that we cover in depth in the Colorist Career Accelerator course, because there's really two things to figure out. It's like, all right, how do we scope this and how do we modify scope for the situation? But on the practical ground level, how do we actually absorb and update the changes, update our timeline based on the changes? What we will ask for depends on how extensive the changes are. There may be some times where there are so many changes and there's been such poor track kept of them that it's actually easier just to get a new XML, conform it from 0, and then trace the grades manually on our side. That can totally be a thing, it'll happen. What's more common is I will ask the editorial team, can you send me what we call a changes XML, which has only the clips in it which have changed. And then we simply go through and we drop those in, and we will usually get an accompanying kind of like recipe or list of changes from editorial so that we can go in and kind of perform that surgery of manually aligning our edit to their new version of the edit. One way or the other, it's not particularly smooth or easy, and it's fairly labor intensive. Doesn't mean we don't do it. We do it all the time, but it is something to think about more. Again, I would say this is more on the professional side. If you're working with clients, like that needs to be something that is understood from the outset. Your scope does not include breaking and changing picture lock once things are locked. And we have a definite process for if that does happen, but part of that process includes billing for additional conform time, if that makes sense. But that's usually one of the two ways we'll do it. It's like, hey, just give us the new XML and we'll deal with tracing over the work we've done thus far. Or if it's more tame and you have a list of the changes that you've made, give us a changes XML, give us a list of the changes that you've made, and we'll have someone go in and manually align our edit to the revisions that you made on your side.
How do you deal with footage of an unknown color space?
Oh, that's a good question. You know, the best place to start with that would be in our color management cheat sheet, which does need an update, but it has a very helpful flow chart within it for dealing with stuff in an unknown color space. Here's the TLDR. Here's what I look at. The big question to ask when you have footage in an unknown color space is, what does it look like right now? Does it look like it's some kind of log, or does it look like it's already kind of display normalized? If it looks somewhat display ready, and the way you would know that is like, this stuff is clearly logged to me because it's so flat in contrast and color. If it looks somewhat display ready, it's in some form of Rec 709, most likely. And that's how I would color manage it. I would just go into my color space transform, Rec 709, we're going to target DaVinci wide gamut, DaVinci intermediate, and then for your input gamma, this is another good rule of thumb. Once you're color managing Rec 709 stuff, the bets are off in terms of like there being one single perfect correct answer for how to do that, because going from display back to scene, there's no single fixed path for doing that. Just like there's no single fixed path for going from scene to display. Going from scene to scene, going from like area wide gamut 3 to red wide gamut RGB, that's math. There's a correct way to do that and many incorrect ways to do that. Going from area wide gamut 3 to Rec 709, there is no single correct way to do that, nor is there a way to go from Rec 709 back to area wide gamut 3. There's simply better or worse ways depending on what you're trying to do. So with that in mind, I will fill these things in usually the same way and then pick either gamma 2.2 or gamma 2.4, sometimes inverse OOTF on, sometimes off, just depending on how it looks. And then tone mapping will be generally something along these lines. We'll go like from maybe 100 to 1,000 nits. I usually won't drive that up to 10,000 just because the dynamic range ain't there, and there's no real reason to. It doesn't seem to offer me much help. So that's what I would do for color managing unknown material that looks like it's already in a Rec 709 format. Otherwise, you can look for, if it looks more loggy, You can look for context clues in your metadata. If you go to your edit page, metadata, all groups here, and you can look, you can see like this stuff, we're actually going to find out. Look, Arri Alexa Mini. Okay, problem solved. So even if I didn't know where this came from, now I know. You might get lucky there and you'll find some metadata that tells you what camera and color space was used. If you don't find anything there either, if you're still striking out, here's what I would do. Again, we're kind of diving more into color management than I want to spend too much time on, but I essentially would lie to resolve and not do any input transform at all. I would say just treat it like it's DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate, and I will grade through any problems that arise from that, because I'd rather just treat it as like DaVinci Wide Gamut is a log space, right? So like just map it into there and you'll deal with the problems that arise from that, which there probably will be, and that's definitely not ideal, but that's kind of the last option. It's like, all right, it doesn't look like Rec 7 or 9. I'm not able to find out from metadata or from asking the person who shot it what the actual log format is. So as a final option, I'm going to simply treat it as if it is DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate, even though I know it is not, and then I'm going to grade through over contrast or weird color primaries or whatever the symptoms might be of the fact that it's not perfectly color managed. It's still going to get you pretty close.
Dan is wondering, what are your steps for dealing with clips that aren't linking because they have different frame rates?
For clips that aren't linking because they have different frame rates, meaning they have different frame rates from the timeline itself. I don't have like a set prescription in that scenario necessarily. The main thing I can tell you is I will check the things that I will do is I will look at the clip. If it is an actual different frame rate, not a speed change, but if the actual clip has a different frame rate, I'll start by playing it down just in the browser here to make sure that it's playing at the frame rate that I want. And if it's not, I'll right-click my clip attributes and force it into the right frame rate. That can totally be a thing. So that might be one thing to check. And then other than that, it kind of comes down to doing a conform lock thing. So I will do a conform lock like we talked about before, conform lock with media pull clip. By the way, this is a great thing to map to a shortcut key like I have here so that you can quickly map lock to a different clip like that, or I'm going to undo and we're back on that one. So I'll conform lock it, and then it's basically a variation on what we just looked at. Like conform lock, if it's not linking at all, and if it is linking but the timing is off, make sure that the frame rate in the clip attributes is right. Make sure that you have any speed changes applied correctly in the timeline. And then from there, you're basically just looking at slipping handles. So T and then S is going to allow you to slip your timing of your actual clip. And that should, if you have your difference mode on, give you a good, you can kind of get that feedback of like, okay, I'm out, I'm out, I'm out, I'm out, I'm out. And I'm, whoop, where's my magic frame? Am I skipping right past it? Yeah, there we go. And now I'm in, right? So it's a variation on that. It's definitely not always as easy as it is coming to me right here, but for clips with different frame rates or speed changes and things like that that might need manual love, it's that same basic process of like, make sure you got the right clip, make sure the timing of the clip is correct, or the frame rate and the speed of the clip is correct, and then slip it into position using your roll and slip tools instead of resolve.
How do you send and receive files to and from clients?
Oh, that's a good question. We've mixed it up a fair amount, and like sometimes we'll get physical drives dropped off here. Sometimes clients will have file hosting solutions that they like to use. We typically will use Massive. That's M-A-S-F, M-A-S-V. That is a really reliable way of quickly transmitting large groups of files. Honestly, like we've had, like on Dropbox can be great if you have a Dropbox account. If you don't, then it can be tough. Google Drive, in our prep sheet, we actually ask you not to use Google Drive because Google Drive has an upper file limit that past which it's going to start chunking stuff into individual zipped files and make a whole mess with it. So we'll use that. We also use Frame.io a lot as well, just for media transfer, in addition to review links and feedback and things like that. We'll just ask them to deposit everything into a Frame.io folder and pull it down from there. So Massive or Frame.io are two very good professional solutions, I would say.
How would you handle a project that has different formats, different frame formats they want to keep, like IMAX ratio and anamorphic footage, and they want to keep the native ratios of both?
Oh, that's a great question. So that's a very advanced workflow, obviously, where you've got mixed aspect ratios, essentially. The way that you want to think about that is you kind of need to work backwards in that case from your deliverable. So what will the deliverable be? And there may be more than one, depending on what the project is, but you're only going to be doing one at a time. So it might be a question of like, all right, this is going to be a 3840 by 2160 deliverable. And within here, my canvas for some of my material is going to be this widescreen thing that I'm doing here. But here's the way to think about it. Like, let's actually divide this out. So that's 3840 by 1634. Yeah, so that's a 235. So if we have mixed formats where the delivery is changing, what we can say for sure is pretty much anytime we're doing a mixed format, that means that at some point, every one of these pixels in this canvas has the potential to be active image, right? So in that case, you actually do need to use some kind of like letterboxing within here. In this case, your canvas really is your delivery resolution, because you're simply going to exploit different pieces of that canvas in different ways for creative purpose. So I would set this up like so, and then either letterbox or pillar box as needed to accommodate the aspect ratio you're wanting to create for those particular scenes. So again, this very much is going to depend on where you're going with this, like what size screen is it going to. But remember, any screen that you're going to, anytime you're doing an aspect ratio change, it's not going to suddenly get like, take for example, if we're showing on if we're going to like a 4:3 format or something from a wider format, the physical screen that we are ultimately going to see that on, it is not going to simultaneously get narrower and taller. Only one of those things is going to happen, right? So it was either wider and we're now narrowing it, or it is already narrow and we are going to shorten it. Does that make sense? It gets kind of slippery, but you want to work backwards from what is your actual deliverable, and you might need to do that twice or three times if you have different deliverables. But essentially, you're going to want to figure out, okay, how am I actually going to fill the canvas of my delivery resolution, and then where am I going to want a letterbox or pillar box as needed to accommodate other aspect ratios that I want to preserve within that active image area of my exhibition format. Slippery stuff, but that would be a pretty good cheat sheet for it. All right, we got time for a couple more, guys.
Derek's wondering if you can show the settings that were changed again on the compound clips, as the settings were underneath your video on your camera feed.
Oh, sure, yeah. So let's make sure that that is remedied. So let's find one of these compound clips here. Here we go. So if I look at here in my inspector, let's move. Let's see here. As always, it's never a good place to put my face. Oh, you know where a good place to put my face is? There's a good place to put my face. So check this out. What I was changing here is in the inspector, we already noted when we pulled this in, even after we set up our image scaling properly, these clips persistently had the scaling set to fit instead of project settings. And that was a problem. It was causing us to get too tall of letterboxes and too wide of an image, right? So our fix for those was to say, no, we want you to, fill. In the case of these compounds, that was already correct here, but inside of the compound, when I right click and I go open in timeline, the setting on the clip within the compound was still set to fit. like so. So this was the state of that first compound when I found it. So what I needed to do is right click, go open in timeline, and then set the scaling of that clip within the compound to project settings, like so. And then pop back out, like that. There you go. All right, let's do one more. If we got them. Maybe we've solved all the woes and challenges and questions of setup and conform.
I think that is it.
Amazing. All right, guys. Well, like I said, I really hope you enjoyed getting to go in kind of a deep dive format into setup, conform, and prep and the role that it plays in my workflow and how I go about these things. And as I promised, this is not the most enthralling thing in and of itself, but I equally promise it's addictive. Once you get into doing this for yourself and you connect up what we talked about today with color management concepts that we talked about in our last session, what you're going to be left with is a brand new way of connecting with what you're doing when you actually go to color grade. When everything is in place and perfectly in position, it's like getting to ride in the front of the plane or like getting to ride in a fancy car. It just feels different. It feels better. You feel like a better colorist as soon as you sit down, which by the way, you will be because you've now got more time to devote to color grading. You don't have any mental overhead that's being left to kind of like linger and wonder like, oh wait, do I need to be looking out for problems in the edit or for mismatches between my edit rebuilt and resolved versus the edit that was handed over to me from editorial? It frees you and sets you up for success and really allows you to inhabit 100% of your creative potential as a colorist. So like I said, maybe not the most exciting thing in the world, but a huge part of winning when it comes to color grading, both on the creative wavelength. And again, if you are working professionally or you want to be working professionally, this is an area where you don't want to lose time or engender problematic or like engender negative vibes with your clients. Easy things to have happen here because Conform, unfortunately, is not as straightforward as it should be in 2024. So I hope you guys enjoyed this walkthrough. Go grab that Conform prep guide if you'd like to have a shorthand guide for yourself and for editors you work with on how to prep things so that they can be easily brought into Resolve and have the edit rebuilt in there. And if you are interested in building up your color grading chops, your color grading technique, maybe you even want to take things to a professional level as a colorist, my Colorist Career Accelerator course is coming up really soon. I'm really excited about it because we've offloaded some of the stuff that I think is really important but can be taught more in a format like this and made more room for things that can't be taught in a single hour-long session and need that deep dive and need that interaction and need those Q&As and feedback that we can do in a different way during that course. So if you are interested in taking your color grading to the next level, whether that's from one level of creative efficiency to the next, or you want to move all the way up to take things to a pro level, definitely encourage you to check out the Colorist Career Accelerator course. If you're on my email list from having grabbed that Conform prep guide or any of my other free resources like my Kodak 2383 or my mid-grade cheat sheet, you're already on the email list and we'll keep you notified as we open up the wait lists. And in fact, the wait list actually already is open. So you'll be in the loop on that course as we're getting revved up for it in December. If not, you can sign up in a link that we're going to leave in the description so that you're the first to know about everything that's coming with the Colorist Career Accelerator course in December. You guys are awesome. Thanks for sharing your Monday morning with me. Great to see you. Gadali, thanks for co-hosting, buddy. And I'll see you guys all soon. Take care.